sir. I'm going to save one for myself this time. Thanks, sir. And is that Brian back there? Are you still back there, Brian? There should be a PowerPoint in the PowerPoint drop that'll just say Bible class. I brought a couple of maps that will hopefully help to visualize. Turn to Daniel chapter 7. That's where I want to start this morning. The stream is not up? Oh, it's not working. Okay, we must be having some kind of a issue with our stream. Daniel chapter 7. Thank you, sir. Okay, it's working on Facebook, but there's an issue with the YouTube stream. All right, so let's go to Daniel chapter 7, and I want to start here just to reiterate. You know, again, I said this last week. I know a lot of what we deal with in a class between the Testaments and in a class covering the period between the Testaments is historical, and sometimes some of this we'll talk about, and it's obviously not a class where we have as many Bible verses that we'll go to, but it is certainly connected to Scripture. So let's start in Daniel chapter 7. And we'll just begin at verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, we'll explain Belshazzar a little bit more today, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had three ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it four wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. And it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. We'll stop there with that, but this vision or dream that Daniel has represents, he dreams or has this vision of 4 beasts, but they represent 4 kingdoms or 4 empires. These empires predominantly are within, sometimes in the case of the first, a little bit before, but predominantly they cover the period between the Testaments. They occur during that time, I guess we could say. The first one being what? We've studied this before. What's the first empire? This first beast here that was like a lion with eagle's wings. We have covered this before. You know it. I know it. Who is it, Bob? I know Bob knows. That's Babylon. And Babylon, we kind of talk sometimes about lion. The lion is the king of the jungle. So you got this powerful lion representing Babylon, mighty Babylon. Sometimes in history you'll read of it as called the Neo-Babylonian Empire because there was a more ancient Babylon. But I would just go with Babylonian. I think most of us are going to know what we're talking about when we say that. But the eagle's wings representing a swift rise to power. The wings were plucked off. You remember in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar got lifted up with pride, and so he was humbled. His ascent, if you will, was cut off in that sense. He was made to stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Again, the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar. But that would be the Babylonian Empire. The second beast is where we began last week talking about, and we'll continue this week, and that is the Medo-Persian Empire. This is represented by a bear in the dream or in the vision, and it's made to stand up on one side. And the reference to that is, I don't know that I mentioned this last week, but that's a reference to the fact that we sometimes will refer to the Persian Empire, and then sometimes we'll refer to the empire as the Medo-Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians. But this empire began with a kind of a conglomeration of the Medes and the Persians. And for a time at the beginning, the Medes were far more powerful. But as time went on, Persia, the cream kind of rose to the top, right? And so Persia takes over, and of course, Cyrus the Great becomes king, ruler of Persia. And so the Persian, eventually it becomes just known as simply the Persian Empire. Well, this was prophesied, rising up on one side. He's got 3 ribs in his mouth, this bear does in the vision, which represents what? We covered this. I don't know if we hit on it too much, but this would be 3 kingdoms. I think I mentioned this maybe briefly last week, and we mentioned it before in kind of a real overview fashion of intertestamental period. But this would be 3 kingdoms, major kingdoms that were powers at the time when Cyrus was coming into his own as a world power, a world ruler. You had Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. Now, I think I mentioned this last week. 2 of these, Lydia and Babylon, Cyrus will conquer. The third one, Egypt, will actually be conquered by his son Cambyses. But that's the reference there, 3 ribs in the mouth. And then they said thus unto it, verse 5 says, arise, devour much flesh. Well, the Persian Empire spread, and I had see if I can find it. I meant to highlight it, and I just realized I didn't. But at one point, the Persian Empire, where is that? It reached just a staggering, it was under Darius. This is reflected in Esther 1, 1:1 and 10:1. But the vast territory was nearly 3,000 miles long and some 500 to 1,500 miles wide. That's a pretty amazing extent of a kingdom. This guy actually also lists that in kilometers, 4,900 kilometers by 800 to 2,400 kilometers. So quite a massive empire. And then, of course, he's going to go on and talk about the leopard, and we'll get to that later on. The leopard representing Greece and Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great would kind of be, I guess, considered more or less the leopard, or I guess that'd be more the empire, however you want to look at that. But the 4 wings of a fowl represents a rapid rise to power. You see that with Nebuchadnezzar having those wings, but with Greece, you see the same thing. Alexander the Great, I forget the number, but it was somewhere around 30 years of age. He had basically conquered the known world. It was just amazing. Very rapid rise to power, but of course, Alexander dies with no heir. And so 4, I guess kind of, for lack of a better term, generals end up taking over, and they kind of divide up the territory, and there's a lot of infighting between them. Again, we'll get to that when we begin to talk about Greece. So you have those four heads that were on this leopard. And dominion was given to it. Again, a vast kingdom. And then, of course, the dreadful beast is what? That'd be Rome. And there's a lot to unpack there when we get to that. So we'll leave it at that for now. But just want to mention that because here and other places in Daniel, other places in Scripture, these things are alluded to. And so sometimes we'll talk about things and it won't be as much where we go, just verse by verse through a text like we would if we were studying a particular book of the Bible. But all of this time period affects Bible study and understanding of Scriptures greatly. We began talking about Cyrus last week, so I'll show you here the empire this is the entire Persian Empire, 539 through 333. This would be, as I mentioned just a moment ago, this would be that vast extent. Let me get the number again. What do we say? About 3,000 miles long and somewhere from 500 to 1,500 miles wide, north and south, in other words. But you can see it's massive. The purple area, all that you see here in purple, that represents, you probably can't read the key up here, but that represents territories conquered by Cyrus. The kind of orangish over here, that's territories gained by Cyrus as well. And then that would be, these are different years. This is the year, 550, 547. And then you go to this greenish color here. This will be territory gained by Cyrus in around 539 BC. Of course, Cyrus dies. His son Cambyses takes over. And he, as I mentioned, is going to go and conquer Egypt. And that's about all Cambyses accomplished as far as new conquest. But you see that there. And then what will be next? The reddish area is territory that was temporarily gained by Xerxes the first, which would be the area of Thrace. But always, 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 they want to conquer Greece over here. And it just never quite happened. Cyrus does accomplish some pertinent to that, but he couldn't fully conquer Greece. And eventually, when Alexander the Great comes on the scene, he really wants a piece of Persia. He's got an axe to grind with Persia because they're constantly trying to conquer Greece. And so he wants to really bring them into subjection. And guess what? He will. He does. That's going to be accomplished. Now, this map is more the empire under Cyrus the Great. So you see the areas that he conquered, and some of this we'll be talking about today, some of these locations and stuff. Hopefully it's just you visualize it a little bit better. Down here you got Babylonia, Susa, Babylon, and then you see they're in pretty close proximity. The Euphrates River is running through here. It's a very important river throughout Bible history. In fact, a lot of times in in Scripture, I like how the New King James goes and capitalizes it because it's a very specific reference. Sometimes the New King James will just have a little r, the river. Well, that's typically, not always, but more often than not, that's a reference to the Euphrates. Now, sometimes you get down here and the Bible will be talking about Egypt. I've been reading my daily Bible reading in the book of Isaiah. Here lately, that's where I am in my daily reading. And there's several prophecies against Egypt, and he'll sometimes reference the river, and you can tell contextually that's not talking about the Euphrates, that's talking about the Nile. And, sometimes it depends on where you are. If you live, anywhere, probably just about anywhere in the state of Mississippi, and somebody was to say, oh, that's over across the river, well, they're talking about what? The Mississippi River, right? And, if you live near the Ohio River or whatever, even around here, somebody lives right close to Pusa, they're talking to one another and they say, oh, that's just, he lives down there. That's a reference to that particular river. So sometimes you have to look at context, but that's Babylon. Cyrus will conquer Babylon and Susa. Up here you've got Lydia and that kingdom, that he'll conquer them as well. And then, as we mentioned later on, Egypt will be left to Cambyses, his son. I want to show you one more map, but I'm going to come back to this one. I really liked this map, but it was low quality. I couldn't find a better quality, like resolution image of it, so it's hard to blow it up very much. But I like this one because it gives you some modern day territory, so you know what you're looking at if you're looking at a modern day map. Here's Turkey, modern day Turkey. This will be the area of Lydia. Greece is still Greece, of course, and that's what Cyrus always had an eye on, but just never could quite conquer. Egypt is still Egypt, of course. But over here you've got what is modern day Iran. Over here is modern day Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. But over here is Afghanistan, in the news a lot nowadays. Pakistan. But see, you can see the Persian Empire even extended way over into what is modern day Pakistan and Afghanistan, almost into India. Alexander the Great's going to go over into India, not terribly far, and really, at one point, Alexander the Great's troops are going to just kind of stop and say, we're not going any further. It's time to go home. Because, you expand, and you can only go so far as the boots on the ground are willing to go, I guess. But, it's a massive empire. That's what I'm getting at here. But I'm going to go back to this one because that's a better map. And we're talking about Cyrus, so I'll leave that up for us as we talk about Cyrus. We left off last week talking about when Cyrus first came to the throne of this kingdom. Anshan is what it's called in history. But the king of Babylon at that time was a man named Nabonidus. We often think of Babylon, we think of Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, there were other kings. Nebuchadnezzar was the one who brought them to their prominence. He established that empire. And really, as so often happens, you see this happen a lot of times with companies and corporations and things like that. You have a genius, somebody who is really locked in, they're driven, hardworking, and they build something up, and they make it something that is just stupendous and great. And sometimes, in fact, by the way, Solomon alludes to this a lot in the book of Ecclesiastes, and he says, what happens to it? They leave it to somebody else. In fact, that's one of the things that Solomon says, everything's vanity. And one of the things that made him just kind of almost want to throw his hands up and say it's all vanity is like, you work yourself silly, you build something, you amass wealth, you build an empire, you build a business, whatever it might be, and then you die and you leave it to somebody else. And then what? And he even talks about sometimes you die and you leave it to a son who maybe could be that he's spoiled, could be that he's coddled, and he just sort of takes it for granted, and he doesn't work like the dad did because the dad was building things, and he sort of had it just handed to him on a silver platter, and he's just kind of like, all right, well, as if it's just going to run itself, and it just sort of goes kaput. And that happens a lot. And that happened in a very real way with the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar was the genius. He built it up, but nobody was quite to the level of Nebuchadnezzar after that. So Nabonidus was the unpopular king of Babylon when Cyrus begins to rule over this small kingdom called Anshan. Nabonidus, focusing on Babylon for just a moment, of course, you've got, again, Babylon right in this area here. Babylon, or Nabonidus, he was kind of I guess we would call him kind of a mystic. I was looking for, I thought it might list Anshan on here, but I'm not seeing it. If I'm not mistaken, it's in this area here, somewhere in this general vicinity. I thought I had seen it listed, but now I'm not. If you see it, holler, because I was just certain that I had seen it, but anyway, maybe I didn't. But Nabonidus, he was sort of a philosopher, a mystic. He's not really what you would picture as a conqueror. He felt called by Marduk, or Marduk. Who is that, by the way? That was one of their idol gods, kind of the chief god of Babylon. He felt called by Marduk to restore the temple of the moon god at Haran. And Nabonidus, he was worried that the proximity of the Medes, now again, the empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, rose up on one side, the Medes, and then later on it's going to swing and the Persians will be more prominent. But he was worried about the proximity of the Medes, that would hinder him being able to restore the temple of the moon god. But, he feels like Marduk's called him to do that. So what to do? So he goes to ask the Priest of Marduk. And it's interesting because they reply that Cyrus is going to march against the Medes and he's going to capture their king, which actually did end up happening. But had they been true prophets, they might have gone ahead and warned Nabonidus that, hey, you are going to fall to Cyrus as well. He's not just going to rise up against the Medes. He's going to rise up against you, Nabonidus. But anyway, in about 550, 549, Cyrus revolted against his Median overlord. This is where the pendulum starts to swing from Medes to Persians. He revolts against his Median overlord, Astyages, if I'm pronouncing that right, and I'm just going to go with that pronunciation. But he revolts. So at this time, Nabonidus over in Babylon, he's going to turn the rule of Babylon over to his son. It's recorded in history as Belshazzar, and it's recorded a little bit differently, but very similarly. It's kind of probably a pronunciation thing. But it's recorded in the Bible as a man that you've read about him before in Daniel chapter 5. What was his name? He's referenced there as the king of Babylon, Belshazzar. And in fact, he says he has this feast, and again, we'll talk about that more a little bit later on, but there's a hand that appears from nowhere, and it's writing on the wall miraculously, just a hand floating in air, and it's writing on the wall, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And he doesn't know what it means. He's terrified. Somebody explain this to me. Nobody can explain it. And his mother says, oh, wait a minute. There's a guy. I know a guy. He interpreted dreams for Nebuchadnezzar. Send for him. He'll be able to tell you what it means. What was that guy's name? Daniel, or Belteshazzar. Don't confuse with Belshazzar, but that was he was given a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. So they send for Daniel, and Daniel comes and, of course, tells him, it's not good news, king. Your kingdom's you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and your days are numbered. In other words, and of course, it happened that night. But one of the things that Belshazzar says is, if somebody can tell me what this means, he's going to give him all these rewards, but he says, I will make him what? Does anybody recall? I will make him the third ruler in the kingdom. And you look at that, I don't know if you've ever read that before and thought, if he's the king and he's going to, elevate whoever can tell him what this means, wouldn't that make that guy the second ruler? But it wouldn't, because who's the king? It's Nabonidus. But Nabonidus has left Belshazzar in charge because, again, he's kind of a philosopher and a mystic. He's going over here to work on the temple of the moon god. Son, you're in charge. So he's second ruler in the kingdom. Belshazzar is so disturbed about this, he says, if somebody can explain it to me, I'll make him the third ruler. So that's what that reference is to there in Daniel chapter 5. So Belshazzar is put in charge, and Nabonidus heads off to restore the moon god's temple, and he's confident that the Medes will be kept busy because, as his so-called prophets have told him, Cyrus is going to revolt against the Medes. Well, Astyages, meanwhile, sends an army against Cyrus because Cyrus has revolted. There's a general, if you want to call him that, a leader of the troops, Harpagus, and he recalls how Astyages had cruelly murdered his son. So guess what he does? He deserts. And along with most of his soldiers, he goes over to Cyrus' side. There's no fight. He just says, hey, I'm with you. I don't like this guy anyways. Let's revolt against him together. So that's what they decide to do. So Astyages determined that he's going to send another army, and he goes with this army. He's going to lead this army personally to go against Cyrus and put down this revolt. So then, basically, they get to the capital of Anshan, and this second army Guess what they did? Do you see a theme here? Can you guess what they did? They deserted. They mutinied. Tells you what kind of ruler Astyages was. So they mutinied, deserted, and they hand him over to Cyrus. Here you go. So again, there's not really even a fight at that point. But Cyrus was a generous conqueror, and history records him as that. It's not all just, oh man, what a nice guy this dude is. I'm not trying to take away, because he was a humane ruler in many ways. That's contrasted with the Assyrians. Do you remember the Assyrians? Sometimes in Scripture it refers to them as taking their prisoners, and they would even sometimes put a hook in their nose and thread a chain or rope or something like that and hold captives together. You talk about making sure your captives stay in line and don't try to escape, but cruel. Sometimes they would lay people down, and run over them with spiked chariot wheels. I mean, they just had all kinds of just over-the-top cruelty. Nebuchadnezzar could be pretty cruel, right? In fact, at one point he has a dream, and nobody can tell him what the dream means, and he's so upset, he says, I want every single, so-called soothsayer, wise man, astrologer, all these so-called people that can interpret dreams and prophesy and things like that, and I want them all killed. Nobody can tell me what this means. Kill them all. And he was going to do it. And Daniel says, whoa. In fact, it's kind of amazing, because Daniel basically says that on faith. There's no indication he knew that God was going to reveal it to him. But after he says that, and they go to talk to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in other words, they pray to God for revelation as to what this dream means. But that's the only thing that stopped Nebuchadnezzar from carrying that out. On another occasion, he's got 3 young men that just decide they're not going to bow down and worship his image. And so he calls them before him, and he says, must be some kind of misunderstanding, because you surely wouldn't defy me. And so we're going to just kind of play this whole thing out again, and if you bow down and worship the image, great. We're going to just forget this all ever happened. But if you don't, you're going into a fiery furnace. And not only that, he doesn't stop there. He says, who is that God that will save you from me? Oh, you don't want to worship my God because it's an idol? Well, who's the God that's going to save you? Well, he found out. Of course, those men were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Cyrus was very different in that sense. In another way, Cyrus was very different, and this comes into play very much with Bible history of the Israelites and leading up to the Messiah. Remember, this is all leading up to the Messiah. When we read this last week, when Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, they brought people in to settle the area, right? And that's how, what race came to be? The Samaritans. Nebuchadnezzar, though, for whatever reason, he didn't repopulate Jerusalem and Judah. When he conquered the southern kingdom, he just left it. He left the poorest of the people to work the land and things like that. But still, you got a lot less people there, but he doesn't repopulate it. So Cyrus is going to come along, and one of the things that he does very differently from most other conquerors is he doesn't just remove the people from their land. In fact, he has a kind of a policy of the way that Pfeiffer puts it in his book is return to normalcy. And what that means is leave them in their land. As long as they recognize Cyrus and Persia as sovereign, leave them alone. And as long as they pay their taxes, right? Otherwise, just leave them alone. And that was kind of his policy. And getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but what he's going to do with the Jews is, Nebuchadnezzar took you from your home? He took your gods? That's the way they would view it, with the utensils from the temple and things like that. And Cyrus is going to say what? I'm going to let you go home. That's his policy, return to normalcy. You can go home. I'm not going to keep you from going home. And go, build the temple to your God. And so that's kind of where Cyrus is so unique, because this was not typical. He did plunder the wealth of the Median capital, But he spared the city, and it actually became one of the capitals of the empire. So this is what characterized the reign of Cyrus. So with Media conquered, Cyrus was at that time ruler over the Median claims in Assyria. Remember, Medes and Babylon went together to conquer Assyria. Well, now he's in charge of all the Median claims in Assyria, what we would call Mesopotamia, Armenia, Cappadocia. And here's the thing. Some of those claims conflicted with Babylon. So there's going to be no more alliances between Babylon and Persia and or the Medes. And this is kind of leading up to a conflict with Babylon. Besides the Medo-Persian Empire, you have three great powers at this time. And that would be, of course, as we pointed out several times, Egypt, Lydia, and as I mentioned, Babylon already. So Egypt, Lydia, Babylon, and, of course, Persia. Those are your four world powers. It's eventually going to become just Persia. But that won't happen. The Egyptian conquest won't happen until after Cyrus. Cyrus is going to go on and conquer Lydia. There's a ruler of Lydia who is an interesting account. He consulted his name was, there's an expression, is it Croesus? Is that how you pronounce that? Any of you historical people? It's Croesus. I think it's pronounced Croesus or Croesus maybe. But anyway, he was the ruler of Lydia. He went to Delphi, and that was, I think, on our map. Delphi, it's on one of these. There it is, right there. Getting in the area of Greece. So you see from Lydia to Delphi is not too far. But he goes to Delphi and he consults with the oracles there before he goes to encounter Cyrus. He's not going to submit to Cyrus. And the oracles tell Croesus, if you go to meet Cyrus, you will destroy a great empire. Now, here's the difference in false prophets and true prophets. Because a true prophet doesn't deal in these generalizations. Sometimes people talk about Nostradamus and, the prophecies of Nostradamus. And if you ever read those, it's a joke. I mean, they're so vague and general. And that's kind of how this is. Well, I mean, I could have stood there and told the guy, if you go and you meet Cyrus, you're going to destroy a great empire. Because was Cyrus' empire at that time a great empire? Yeah, it already was a pretty great empire once he conquered the Medes and defeated Astyages. Was Lydia a great empire at that time? Yeah. So unless they fight to a draw and they both just destroy each other, that's a pretty safe prophecy, so-called, to make. Problem is, they didn't tell him which empire he was going to destroy, which great empire. Well, the one he destroyed, of course, was his own. Cyrus offers him, you can keep your throne and your kingdom, just recognize Persian sovereignty. He refused. So Cyrus attacked. There were a couple of indecisive battles. Croesus was defeated before any help could arrive from Egypt or Greece or Babylon or even Sparta. Sparta at this time was, they weren't really what you call a world power, but they were no joke either. So he sends out for help from just about anybody he can think of to get help from. But before they can arrive, Cyrus conquers him. So that brings Lydia, this area in here, under the control of Cyrus. So the kingdom is spreading. Well, that conquest brought him into contact with Greek cities of Asia Minor who had made peace with Croesus. So you get in here, Athens, Marathon, some of these areas, Thrace. So it brings him in contact with them, having conquered Lydia. So now he's got to deal with them. The only demand was for the coastal cities to recognize his sovereignty. Most of them refused, and they were conquered one by one. Now, again, these are Greek cities in Asia Minor. These will be what we sometimes study in history, the city-states. And he gets to Greece proper, that just never did happen for Persia. Some of these conquests came by strength of arms, in other words, fighting, and some of them came by Persian diplomacy. You know how you spell that? Gold. When we say diplomacy, it was gold. Cyrus says, I got all the money. You can come to me and you can be part of a wealthy, rich kingdom and be blessed by that yourselves, or you can resist and I'll destroy you. So again, yeah, he was humane in some ways, but he was also, he's a conqueror. And that's what they do. So some of them were conquered by might of arms, but some of them said, okay, you know what? Sure, you're wealthy. We'll take it. We'll go with that. The conquest of Greek Asia Minor led to two of these Persian satrapies, as we call them. There was one that was Ionian, one that was called those of the sea. But sooner or later, Persia's going to have to fight the mainland Greeks. But the other conquests in the east are going to come first. He's shoring up the east for security reasons. The money is in the west. In fact, over here, especially in the Greek area, Greek Asia Minor, that's where the money is. And again, Lydia was one of the main ones, and that's why I was saying there's an expression Pfeiffer refers to in his book as rich as Croesus. It sometimes is used. I don't know that I've heard that maybe once or twice in my life that I can recall, but apparently in some circles that's a popular expression. But he has to take care of things over here, because what good is all the money over here if you got people encroaching upon you and they're going to conquer you? So he's got to deal with east. And so that's where he's focusing first. He heads eastward while he's conquering Lydia and Greek Asia Minor. Back in Babylon, Nabonidus is having his own issues. Nebuchadnezzar, again, had developed Babylon, that is, into a progressive and efficient state, this great empire. But under Nabonidus and even under his son Belshazzar, there was corruption, there was mismanagement, greed, and Belshazzar brought the people of Babylon nearly to starvation. So you have this kind of a general of Nebuchadnezzar. He's called in history Gobrias. The Babylonians refer to him as Gubaru. He deserted to Cyrus. Again, you see a theme here. And he began to attack Babylonian territory. Meanwhile, Cyrus again is focused on the east. And so Cyrus' eastern campaign, you don't really have a whole lot about that chronicled in history, by the way. It focuses on Lydia and Babylon. But so Cyrus ends up, he's ready to focus on Babylon. He's shored up the east. Now he says the next big power that's got to go is Babylon. So he turns his attention to Babylon. Cyrus considers himself more deliverer than conqueror. And here's the ironic thing. A lot of the Babylonians considered him more deliverer than conqueror. They were not happy. Nabonidus, again, he's kind of a philosopher, a mystic. He is wholly unsuited to deal with someone whose level of genius was that of Cyrus. Historians look back and, he had might of arms, don't get me wrong, but Cyrus was a genius. Just in so many different ways. Nabonidus was completely out of his league trying to deal with that. So Nabonidus, he just decides to let the gods, so-called little g gods, be his guardians. And so he would even take idols from other Babylonian regions, other regions that were under their rule, and he brought them to Babylon, into his area where he is, to be his protectors. But you know what that did? If you're in this region over here, and you've got your gods and your temples, and all of a sudden the emperor, the king, marches in and sends emissaries, and they say, we're taking your gods because Nabonidus needs them to protect him back over in Babylon. Are you happy about that, or are you not too happy about it? They weren't happy at all. So he made a lot of enemies, and that's why when Cyrus comes and views himself as deliverer, a lot of the Babylonian people did as well. So Cyrus, he takes Sippar without battle. Nabonidus fled, left Belshazzar in charge. 2 days later, you have this Gubaru or Gobrias of Elam. This would be the Darius of Daniel chapter 6. He captures Babylon, also without battle. And Belshazzar, of course, was killed. That's right on the heels of what you read about in Daniel chapter 5 with the writing on the wall. And so Cyrus, again, he realizes the value of the need for a return to normalcy. and his view was that Marduk himself had provided a righteous ruler in the person of Cyrus. Now, Cyrus was a good guy in many ways, but he was idolatrous. So he's like, Marduk has chosen me. He believed in this idol of the Babylonians, and so he believed he was chosen to be the righteous ruler. Well, the religious people of Babylon accepted him as such because he's going to restore their gods to their rightful places. These gods that Nabonidus had brought here, so-called to protect him, he says, hey, let's put them back in their rightful places in their temples where he brought them from, where he stole them from, essentially. And so now that makes those people happy. They like Cyrus. Babylonian policy was to remove conquered people, as did Assyria. Again, Jewish captives were taken into Babylon, but Cyrus returned to normalcy policy, led him to announce, captives, Jews, you've been uprooted from your home. Would you like to go home? Have at it. Go home. So he allows them to go home. Again, the motives were not 100% humanitarian because what's on his mind? Egypt. Is it better for you to have just an empty, virtually barren land there where Egypt can move in and set up and begin to build defenses and things like that? Or is it better to have people settled there that are going to be friendly to you and your agenda? Well, to ask that question is to answer it. So again, it's not 100% humanitarian, but he was a humane ruler. There were loyal settlers now that would be in the buffer area of Syria, Palestine, and they're going to be helpful when he wants to conquer Egypt. At least that's how he viewed it. He was humane, yes, but he was equally shrewd, and his policy pertaining to captives shows both. Kind of wrapping up Cyrus, Cyrus and the Jews. The Jews had no image to restore to a shrine per se, obviously, because they worshiped the one God, the one true God. But Nebuchadnezzar had taken things from the temple, right? We read about that when he conquers Jerusalem. In fact, that's what's going on in Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar says, bring out all these utensils and let's have a party and drink from the gold cups that were taken out of the temple. And so Cyrus says, you can take those back home. You can return home. But here's the thing. Many of the Jews were prospering in Babylon and they didn't want to go back. So some decided to stay. About 50,000 will return back to the Palestinian area. For whatever reason, Daniel remained in Babylon. We don't know why. But Esther records the influence and the trials of the Jews in the Persian Empire. Nehemiah also under Artaxerxes. But let's go to Ezra Chapter 1 real quick before we run out of time and just see this decree. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of summing up Cyrus and the Jews because he's such an important person relative to the Jews and especially the return from captivity. Ezra chapter 1. This is the decree. Ezra covers a lot of time, and you have to remember that. There's kind of some breaks, and Esther happens within some of this, at least within the time period. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord, God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. So he says, you want to go home? Go home. And he allows them to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of wrap up Cyrus and start talking about Cambyses and Darius. That'll get us into what happens in Esther, Nehemiah, and then we'll begin to move into start looking at the reign of Alexander the Great over Greece. And you'll see how all this ties in with Bible history. Again, all leading up to the Messiah. Thank you. We'll have a break before our worship.